Picture this. Christmas morning at my sister's mansion, and my 7-year-old twins are carefully unwrapping what appear to be the most beautiful gifts under the tree. Their little faces are glowing with excitement as they peel back layers of expensive wrapping paper and satin ribbons. But when they finally open those gorgeous boxes, their smiles fade into confusion. Empty. Completely empty. While their cousins are screaming with joy over brand new iPads and designer sneakers, my babies are sitting there holding nothing but decorated cardboard. That's when my sister Jessica starts laughing and announces to the entire room that it was all just a hilarious joke. What happened next still gives me chills, and it changed our family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lisa Martinez, and I'm a 32-year-old single mother living in Denver, Colorado. Every day feels like I'm running a marathon while carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. But I wouldn't trade my life for anything because of two incredible little humans who call me Mom. Katie and Ben are my 7-year-old twins, and they're the reason I get up every morning with purpose, even when that morning technically starts at 2 in the afternoon. Because I've been working the night shift at Denver General Hospital. Being a nurse wasn't exactly the path I planned when I was younger. Growing up in Colorado Springs, I had dreams of becoming a teacher, maybe traveling the world, definitely not changing bedpans and dealing with medical emergencies while most people are sleeping. But life has a way of rewriting your story when you're not paying attention. I got pregnant with the twins when I was 24. Married their father Daniel in a small ceremony at the courthouse, and thought we were going to build this beautiful life together. By the time the kids were 2, Daniel had decided that fatherhood wasn't for him, and I found myself signing divorce papers while trying to figure out how to survive as a single mom. That's when I discovered that nursing school was something I could do at night while the kids slept, and the medical field was desperate enough for workers that they'd help me find financial aid. It took me 3 years of studying after bedtime, stories and clinical rotations during weekend visits with their grandparents, but I finally earned my RN license. Now I work the overnight shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., taking care of patients when the hospital is quieter and the world outside feels like it's holding its breath. Our little duplex on the east side of Denver isn't much to look at from the outside. The paint is peeling a bit around the window frames, and the front steps creak when you walk up them. But inside, it's filled with everything that matters. Katie's artwork covers the refrigerator and most of one wall in the living room. She's got this incredible imagination and can turn a simple crayon drawing into an entire story about dragons and princesses and magical kingdoms where everyone is kind to each other. Ben is our little scientist, always asking questions about how things work and why the sky changes colors and whether ants have feelings. His room is filled with rocks he's collected from every park we've visited, each one carefully labeled with masking tape and his careful 7-year-old handwriting. Every morning when I come home from the hospital, I'm exhausted in ways that go deeper than just physical tiredness. There's something about caring for people in their most vulnerable moments that takes pieces of your soul, even when it's the most rewarding work you can imagine. But when I walk through that front door and see Katie and Ben getting ready for school, usually with help from Mrs. Rodriguez next door, who's been our guardian angel since we moved in 3 years ago, everything else fades away. They run to me with their arms wide open, still in their pajamas and smelling like the strawberry shampoo we buy in bulk from the dollar store. And suddenly, I'm not tired anymore. Our routine is sacred to me. After they leave for school, I sleep until about 2 in the afternoon, then pick them up from Jefferson Elementary, where they both somehow manage to be honor roll students despite everything we've been through. We come home and sit at our tiny kitchen table where they show me their homework and tell me about their day while I make them a snack. Katie always wants to help cook, standing on the step stool we found at a garage sale and stirring whatever I'm making with the concentration of a professional chef. Ben prefers to sit nearby and read me facts from whatever library book he's currently obsessed with. Last month it was dinosaurs. This month it's space exploration, and next month it'll probably be something completely different. Evenings are for dinner together. Usually something simple because I need to leave for work by 9:30. Then homework time where we spread everything out on the living room floor and work together until it's done. Bath time is a negotiation every single night, with both kids somehow convinced that soap is optional and brushing teeth is more like a suggestion than a requirement. But story time is never negotiable. We pile onto my bed, Katie on one side and Ben on the other, and I read to them until their eyelids get heavy and their questions about the characters start getting silly. Mrs. Rodriguez arrives at 9:15. Every night, right on schedule, carrying her knitting bag and usually some kind of homemade treat for the kids' lunchboxes the next day. She's 73 years old with silver hair that she wears in a neat bun and the kind of smile that makes you feel like everything is going to be okay. Her own grandchildren live in California, and she's told me more than once that Katie and Ben help fill the quiet in her house. She never makes me feel guilty about leaving them, never acts like it's a burden, and always has stories about their evening adventures when I come home in the morning. The hardest part about working nights isn't the physical exhaustion, or dealing with difficult patients, or even missing out on evening activities with my kids. It's the constant worry that I'm not enough, that they need more than I can give them, that somehow my love and determination aren't sufficient to make up for everything we don't have. When other parents are talking about family vacations to Disney World or expensive summer camps or private tutoring, I'm calculating whether we can afford new shoes for both kids at the same time or if one of them needs to wait until next month. But here's what I've learned in the past 5 years of doing this alone. My kids don't measure love in dollars, and they don't compare our life to anyone else's unless adults make them feel like they should. Katie has never complained that her art supplies come from the clearance section at Walmart instead of the fancy art store downtown. Ben has never seemed disappointed that our science experiments use baking soda and vinegar instead of expensive chemistry sets. They're happy because they're loved, they're secure because they know I'd do anything for them, and they're confident because I've spent 7 years telling them they can be anything they want to be. That confidence is what made Christmas so important to me this year. Both kids had been talking about presents they hoped to find under the tree since Halloween. Not in a greedy way, but with the kind of innocent excitement that makes Christmas magical. Katie had fallen in love with a deluxe art set she'd seen at Target, complete with colored pencils, markers, watercolors, and a wooden easel. Every time we walked past it in the store, she'd stop and just look at it with wonder, running her fingers along the display model like she was memorizing every detail. Ben had discovered a chemistry set that promised to help kids conduct real experiments safely, and he'd checked it out every time we went shopping, reading the back of the box out loud and explaining to me why each component was important for proper scientific investigation. For 3 months, I saved every extra penny I could find. The tips from patients' families went into a mason jar hidden in my bedroom closet. Change from grocery shopping got counted and added to the collection. I picked up extra shifts whenever they were available, even when it meant coming home so tired I could barely keep my eyes open for story time. By the beginning of December, I had enough money to buy both gifts, and I felt like I'd accomplished something incredible. That's when my sister Jessica called with her annual Christmas invitation. Every year, she hosts this elaborate Christmas celebration at her house in Cherry Hills Village, one of Denver's most expensive neighborhoods. Her husband, Mark, is a software engineer who developed some kind of app that made them wealthy enough to buy a house that looks like it belongs in a magazine. Jessica herself works as a marketing executive for a tech company downtown, and together they live the kind of life that looks perfect from the outside. Beautiful house, expensive cars, designer clothes, and 2 kids who have never had to worry about whether they could afford something they wanted. Jessica is 3 years older than me, and growing up, she was everything I thought I wanted to be. She was the student council president in high school, graduated summa cum laude from the University of Colorado, and seemed to have her entire life planned out before she turned 25. When I got pregnant with the twins, she was the one who sat me down and asked if I was sure I was ready for this responsibility. When Daniel left, she was the one who suggested I might want to consider giving the kids a more stable home with parents who could provide better opportunities. She's never been cruel exactly, but she has this way of making her concern sound like criticism and her help feel like charity. But she always invited us to Christmas, and the kids loved seeing their cousins Alex and Emma, who are 10 and 8, respectively. Alex is obsessed with video games and technology, just like his father, and he's always willing to show Ben his latest gadgets or explain how different devices work. Emma is into fashion and music, and she treats Katie like a little sister, sometimes even sharing her clothes or letting her try on different makeup looks. Despite the obvious differences in our circumstances, the kids genuinely enjoyed each other's company, and I thought it was important for Katie and Ben to have those family connections. This year felt different, though. When Jessica called to invite us, there was something in her tone that made me hesitate. She kept emphasizing how excited the kids would be to see all the amazing presents Santa was bringing to her house, and how it would be such a great experience for Katie and Ben to see what Christmas could look like. She offered to let us stay overnight Christmas Eve so the kids could wake up Christmas morning with their cousins, and she kept mentioning how much fun it would be for everyone to open gifts together. I should have trusted my instincts. There was something about the way she talked about presents and Christmas morning that felt off, like she was planning something beyond just a normal family celebration. But Katie and Ben were so excited about sleeping over at their cousin's house and waking up Christmas morning somewhere that felt like a fairy tale. And I wanted them to. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Have that experience. I wanted them to feel included in something big and magical, even if it meant spending Christmas morning somewhere other than our own home. So I said yes, and I spent the weeks leading up to Christmas wrapping their real presents and hiding them in my bedroom closet, planning to give them their gifts when we got home from Jessica's house. I bought wrapping paper and ribbons, wrote careful tags in my best handwriting, and imagined how their faces would light up when they finally got to open the things they'd been hoping for all year. Christmas Eve at Jessica's house was like stepping into a different world. Her tree was 12 feet tall and decorated with ornaments that looked like they belonged in a store window. Every surface in her living room was covered with perfectly arranged decorations, and the pile of presents under the tree was so large it took up a quarter of the room. Katie and Ben walked around with their mouths open, taking in all the lights and glitter and luxury like they were touring a museum. The kids went to bed that night in Emma's room, sleeping on an air mattress that was probably more expensive than our couch, whispering excitedly about Christmas morning and what they might find under that magnificent tree. I stayed up late with Jessica and Mark, drinking wine and catching up, though most of the conversation centered around their recent vacation to Europe and their plans to renovate their kitchen again. When Jessica asked about my work at the hospital, it felt more like polite conversation than genuine interest. But I tried to stay positive and focus on how much I loved helping people during their most difficult times. Christmas morning arrived with Katie and Ben bouncing on my bed at 6 a.m., more excited than I'd ever seen them. They'd been talking to their cousins, and apparently Jessica had made a big deal about how everyone was going to open presents together as one big family, and how special it was going to be. Alex and Emma were already downstairs, and the sound of wrapping paper and excited voices was drifting up from the living room. When we made it downstairs, the scene was exactly what you'd expect from a Christmas morning in a house where money wasn't a concern. Alex was already deep into setting up some kind of virtual reality gaming system, and Emma was taking selfies with a professional quality camera that probably cost more than I make in a month. Jessica's parents were there, along with Mark's sister, and her family, and everyone was dressed in matching Christmas pajamas that looked like they'd been ordered from an expensive catalog. That's when Jessica made a big announcement about special presents she had for Katie and Ben. She disappeared into another room and came back carrying 2 large boxes wrapped in the most beautiful paper I'd ever seen, with elaborate bows and ribbons that looked like they'd been done by a professional. She placed them ceremoniously in front of my kids, and made this whole speech about how excited she was to give them something extra special this year, something that would teach them an important lesson about Christmas and family. Katie and Ben approached those boxes like they contained treasures beyond imagination. They'd never received presents wrapped so beautifully, and they handled them with the kind of reverence you'd show to something precious and fragile. Katie carefully untied the ribbon on her box, trying not to damage it because she wanted to save it, and Ben meticulously peeled back each piece of tape so the wrapping paper wouldn't tear. The entire room was watching them, and there was this expectant energy like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Jessica had her phone out, recording the whole thing, and she kept encouraging them to hurry up and see what was inside. Mark was smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes, and Jessica's parents were watching with expressions I couldn't quite read. When Katie finally got her box open and looked inside to find absolutely nothing, her face went through this series of expressions that broke my heart. First, confusion, like maybe she was looking in the wrong place. Then she turned the box upside down and shook it gently, thinking perhaps something had gotten stuck. Finally, she looked up at Jessica with this bewildered expression and said quietly, "Aunt Jessica, I think there might be a mistake. There's nothing in here." Ben opened his box a few seconds later and had almost the same reaction, except he's always been more practical than his sister. He examined the box carefully, looked at the wrapping paper like maybe there were clues he'd missed, and then announced matter-of-factly, "This box is empty. Did the present fall out somewhere?" That's when Jessica started laughing. Not a gentle, "Oh, isn't that funny" laugh, but this loud, performative laughter that filled the whole room. She clapped her hands together and said, "Surprise! It's a joke. Isn't that hilarious? I thought it would be so funny to give them empty boxes and see their faces." The room went silent except for her laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Mark chuckled nervously and said something about how creative and unexpected it was. A couple of other adults made those uncomfortable sounds people make when they don't know whether they're supposed to laugh or not. But my kids just sat there, holding their empty boxes, and I could see Katie's bottom lip starting to tremble as she tried to understand why someone would think it was funny to disappoint children on Christmas morning. That's when Jessica delivered the line that felt like a punch to my chest. She looked around the room with this satisfied expression and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I thought it would be a good lesson for them about expectations and entitlement. I mean, Lisa can't really afford much this year anyway, so I figured they should learn that Christmas isn't always about getting things. Sometimes the best gift is learning to be grateful for what you have." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother, who had been quietly sipping her coffee in the corner, set down her mug and stared at her hands. Mark's face went red, and he suddenly became very interested in helping Alex with his new gaming system. The other adults in the room found excuses to look anywhere except at me and my children, who were still sitting on the floor holding empty boxes while their cousins played with hundreds of dollars worth of new toys around them. In that moment, I felt every emotion it's possible for a human being to experience. Rage at Jessica for humiliating my children in front of the entire family. Shame that everyone was now thinking about our financial situation and judging our circumstances. Heartbreak for Katie and Ben, who had done nothing to deserve being made the center of such a cruel joke. And underneath it all, a fierce protective instinct that made me want to grab my kids and get them away from this toxic situation as quickly as possible. But before I could say anything, before I could figure out how to respond to such calculated cruelty disguised as a lesson, something extraordinary happened that changed everything. Katie and Ben looked at each other with that wordless communication that twins sometimes have, and then they both stood up quietly and walked over to where they'd left their small backpacks by the front door. I watched, confused and still processing what had just happened, as they unzipped their bags and each pulled out a small, carefully wrapped package. The wrapping paper was from the dollar store, and the ribbons were probably left over from birthday parties. But those gifts had been wrapped with the kind of care and attention that only children put into presents for people they love. Katie walked back over to Jessica, holding her package with both hands, and said in her clear, serious voice that she uses when she's trying to be very grown up, "Aunt Jessica, we brought you a present. We made it ourselves because Mom taught us that giving is better than getting, and we wanted you to have something special for Christmas." Ben nodded solemnly and held out his own package toward Mark. "Uncle Mark, this is for you. We worked really hard on them and used our allowance money to buy the supplies. We hope you like them." The transformation in that room was instantaneous and complete. Every conversation stopped. Every adult turned to stare at my 7-year-old children, who were responding to deliberate humiliation with genuine generosity. Jessica's laughter died in her throat, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely speechless. Jessica reached out with trembling hands to accept Katie's gift, and I could see something shift in her expression as she held that small, carefully wrapped package. The confidence that had been radiating from her just moments before, when she was laughing about her cruel joke, had completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. She unwrapped it slowly, as if she was afraid of what she might find inside, and when she saw what Katie had made for her, her face went completely pale. It was a bookmark, handcrafted from construction paper and decorated with pressed flowers, that Katie had been collecting from our neighborhood walks all autumn. She'd arranged them in a delicate pattern and covered them with clear contact paper that we'd bought specifically for this project, creating something that was both beautiful and functional. At the top, in Katie's careful 7-year-old handwriting, were the words, "For Aunt Jessica, who loves to read like me. Love, Katie." Below that, she'd drawn a small picture of 2 women sitting together with books in their hands, one tall and one small, both smiling. The bookmark was exactly the kind of gift that Katie always made: thoughtful, personal, and created with the assumption that the recipient would treasure it because of the love behind it, rather than its monetary value. She'd remembered that. Jessica had mentioned enjoying mystery novels the last time we'd visited, and she'd spent weeks planning how to make something that would be useful for someone who loved books. The pressed flowers were varieties that Jessica had admired in our tiny backyard garden during a summer visit, and Katie had been carefully preserving them between the pages of her own library books, waiting for the perfect project. Mark unwrapped Ben's gift with similar reverence, and what he found was a keychain made from polymer clay that Ben had shaped and painted himself. It was designed to look like a miniature computer, complete with a tiny keyboard and screen, painted in realistic detail with acrylic paints that Ben had applied with the precision of an artist working on a masterpiece. Attached to the computer was a small tag that read, "For Uncle Mark, because Mom says you're always losing your keys and computers are your favorite thing. From Ben." The keychain was practical and personal, reflecting Ben's understanding that Mark worked with technology and his desire to create something that would actually be useful in his uncle's daily life. Both gifts represented hours of work, careful planning, and the kind of genuine thoughtfulness that can't be manufactured or purchased. Katie and Ben had used their own allowance money to buy the supplies, money they could have spent on candy or toys or any of the small treasures that 7-year-olds typically find irresistible. Instead, they'd chosen to sacrifice their own desires to create something meaningful for adults who, in their minds, deserved to be honored and celebrated during the Christmas season. The silence in the room was profound and uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that happens when everyone realizes they've witnessed something that challenges their assumptions about the world. Jessica was staring at the bookmark in her hands like she'd never seen anything like it before, turning it over carefully and examining every detail of Katie's work. Mark was holding the keychain up to the light, studying the intricate painting that Ben had done, and I could see his throat working as he tried to swallow past some emotion that was threatening to overwhelm him. Katie looked up at Jessica with those bright, hopeful eyes that still believed the best about people and said softly, "Do you like it, Aunt Jessica? I picked flowers that match the colors in your living room, and I tried to make the ladies in the picture look like us so you'd remember me when you use it." Her voice held no trace of hurt or resentment about the empty boxes. no awareness that she'd just been the victim of deliberate cruelty. She was simply a little girl who had worked hard to make something special for someone she loved, eager to know if her efforts had been appreciated. Ben stepped closer to Mark and pointed to the tiny details on his keychain creation. "See, Uncle Mark? I painted all the little keys on the keyboard, and I made the screen blue like the computers at school. Mom helped me look up pictures of real computers so I could make it look right. And I put a little loop on the back so it won't break when you put it on your real keys." His explanation was matter-of-fact and proud, the way children are when they've accomplished something difficult and want to share their process with adults who might appreciate the complexity of their work. Mark knelt down to Ben's eye level, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Ben, this is incredible. Did you really paint all these tiny details yourself?" When Ben nodded enthusiastically, Mark continued, "This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me. I can tell you worked really hard on it, and I'm going to use it every single day." He attached the keychain to his own keys right there in front of everyone, making a show of how perfectly it fit and how much he loved having it. Jessica was still staring at Katie's bookmark, and when she finally looked up at her niece, there were tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Katie, this is beautiful. You made this yourself?" When Katie nodded proudly, Jessica's voice became even softer. "And you remembered that I like to read? You thought about what I would enjoy?" Katie's enthusiastic confirmation seemed to hit Jessica like a physical blow, and she had to take a deep breath before she could continue speaking. The contrast between what had just happened and what was happening now couldn't have been more stark. Minutes earlier, Jessica had been laughing about giving my children empty boxes as a lesson in managing expectations and being grateful for what they had. She'd made jokes about our financial situation and turned my kids' Christmas morning into a public humiliation that was designed to entertain the adults at their expense. Now she was holding a gift that represented everything she'd been mocking, the kind of thoughtful generosity that comes from love rather than abundance, the beauty that can be created when someone cares more about giving joy than about impressing others with expensive purchases. Alex and Emma, who had been absorbed in their new electronics, were now watching their parents' reactions with confusion. They'd grown up in a world where gifts were measured by their price tags and their ability to impress, where Christmas morning was about accumulating as many expensive items as possible and comparing what you'd received with what your friends got. The idea that a handmade bookmark or keychain could move adults to tears was completely foreign to their experience, and I could see them trying to understand why their parents were acting so strangely about such simple presents. My mother, who had been silent since Jessica's cruel announcement about the empty boxes, finally stood up and walked over to where Katie and Ben were standing. She knelt down and pulled both of them into a gentle hug, and when she spoke, her words were directed at my children but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "You two are the most generous, thoughtful children I've ever known. These gifts you made are absolutely beautiful, and the love you put into them makes them more precious than anything money could buy." She looked up at Jessica and Mark with an expression that managed to be both proud and pointed. "Your mother has raised you to understand what Christmas is really about, and you've just given everyone here a reminder of what truly matters." The other adults in the room were shifting uncomfortably, clearly aware that they'd witnessed something that reflected poorly on their own behavior. Jessica's in-laws were whispering to each other in the corner, and I caught fragments of their conversation that suggested they were questioning the wisdom of the empty box joke and wondering why they hadn't intervened when it happened. Mark's sister kept looking back and forth between her own children and mine, as if she was making mental comparisons about the values being demonstrated by different approaches to parenting and gift-giving. Jessica finally found her voice, though it was shaky and uncertain in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Katie, I want to apologize. The empty boxes were supposed to be funny, but they weren't funny at all. They were mean, and you didn't deserve that. You and Ben are amazing kids, and you've just taught me something important about what it means to Be generous. She looked around the room at all the expensive gifts scattered everywhere, then back down at the simple bookmark in her hands. This is the most meaningful present I've received in years, maybe ever. I can tell how much thought and work you put into it, and I promise I'll treasure it always. Mark was nodding in agreement, still examining Ben's keychain with wonder. You know what, Ben? I've gotten a lot of expensive gifts over the years, but nobody has ever made me something with their own hands before. Nobody has ever taken the time to think about what I would actually use and enjoy, and then spent their own money and effort to create it just for me. This keychain means more to me than you could possibly understand. He paused and looked around the room at his family and friends. These kids have just shown all of us what real giving looks like. But Katie and Ben weren't finished. Katie walked over to where Alex was sitting with his new gaming equipment and said quietly, Alex, do you want to see how I made the bookmark? I could teach you how to press flowers if you want. It's really fun, and you could make one for someone special. Her offer was genuine and enthusiastic, without any hint that she was trying to make a point or teach a lesson. She simply wanted to share something she enjoyed with her cousin, the way children naturally do when they're excited about a new skill or hobby. Ben approached Emma, who was still taking pictures with her expensive new camera, and said, Emma, would you like to take pictures of our presents? Mom always takes pictures of things we make so we can remember them later. Maybe you could help me document my keychain project for my science journal at school. Again, there was no agenda in his request beyond genuine interest in including his cousin in something meaningful to him. The responses from Alex and Emma were telling. Alex put down his gaming controller, something I'd never seen him do voluntarily before, and said, Yeah, Katie, I'd like to learn how to do that. Could we pick flowers from our garden and make bookmarks for Mom and Dad? Emma lowered her camera and looked thoughtfully at Ben's keychain. That's actually really cool, Ben. Could you teach me how to make things like that? I never learned how to make stuff with my hands. What was happening in that room was a complete shift in values and priorities, initiated by two 7-year-old children who had responded to cruelty with kindness and to humiliation with generosity. My kids hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson or make a statement about materialism versus meaningful giving. They'd simply acted according to the principles I'd tried to instill in them. That love is expressed through thoughtfulness, that the best gifts come from the heart rather than the wallet, and that Christmas is about bringing joy to others rather than accumulating things for yourself. Jessica was still holding Katie's bookmark, but now she was examining it with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for precious artifacts. She traced the pressed flowers with her finger and read Katie's message again, and I could see her beginning to understand the hours of work and planning that had gone into creating something so deceptively simple. Katie, she said softly, can you tell me about these flowers? Where did you find them? And how did you learn to preserve them like this? Katie's face lit up with excitement at being asked to explain her process. Well, Aunt Jessica, I started collecting them in September when Mom and I were walking around our neighborhood after dinner. I found the purple ones by the park, and the yellow ones were growing by Mrs. Rodriguez's fence. She said I could pick some as long as I was careful not to damage the plants. Then I looked up how to press flowers at the library, and the librarian helped me find a book that showed different ways to do it. I've been keeping them in my heaviest school books for months, checking on them every week to make sure they were drying properly. The detail in Katie's explanation revealed just how much thought and preparation had gone into her gift. This wasn't a last-minute craft project thrown together in an afternoon. She'd been planning and working on this present for months, carefully, collecting materials and learning new techniques specifically because she wanted to create something special for her aunt. The level of dedication and foresight was remarkable for a child her age, and it highlighted the stark difference between genuine generosity and the performative giving that had characterized most of the morning's gift exchange. Ben was equally eager to share the story of his keychain creation when Mark asked about his process. I started working on it after Thanksgiving, Uncle Mark. First, I had to learn about polymer clay at the library, just like Katie did with her flowers. Then, Mom took me to the craft store, and I used my allowance money to buy the clay and the paints. It took me 4 tries to get the shape right because I kept making the keyboard too big or too small. And then I had to paint it really carefully with tiny brushes because I wanted all the keys to look real. Mom helped me look up pictures of different computers on her phone so I could get the colors right. The patience and persistence that Ben described were extraordinary for a 7-year-old. Most children his age would have given up after the first failed attempt, but he'd continued, working and learning until he achieved the result he wanted. His dedication to accuracy and detail, researching real computers to make his clay version as authentic as possible, showed the same kind of thoughtful consideration that had characterized Katie's flower pressing project. Mark was shaking his head in amazement. "Ben, you mean you spent your own money on this? Money you could have used to buy toys or candy for yourself?" When Ben nodded matter-of-factly, as if the sacrifice was obvious and unremarkable, Mark looked around the room with an expression that seemed to be asking the other adults if they were truly comprehending what they were witnessing. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was becoming more pronounced by the minute. The expensive gifts that had seemed so impressive earlier were now sitting forgotten, while everyone focused on 2 handmade presents that had cost less than $10 to create, but represented weeks of planning, effort, and sacrifice. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and I could see it affecting everyone present in different ways. My mother was wiping away tears that she wasn't bothering to hide, clearly moved by her grandchildren's demonstration of genuine generosity. Mark's parents, who had initially seemed amused by Jessica's empty box prank, were now looking uncomfortable and ashamed, as if they were reconsidering their earlier reaction. Even the younger cousins were beginning to understand that something significant was happening, though they couldn't quite articulate what it was that made these simple gifts so much more meaningful than the expensive electronics they'd received. Jessica stood up slowly, still clutching Katie's bookmark, and walked over to where I was sitting. For the first time since we'd arrived, she looked directly into my eyes, and what I saw there was a mixture of shame, regret, and something that might have been respect. "Lisa," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology too. What I did this morning was inexcusable, and the way I talked about your situation was cruel and unnecessary. But more than that, I think I owe you congratulations. You've raised 2 incredible children who understand things about generosity and love that I'm apparently still learning at 35. Her words were sincere, and I could tell that the transformation happening in her was genuine rather than performative. She wasn't apologizing because she'd been caught being cruel, but because she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd almost destroyed with her thoughtless joke. The empty boxes had been intended to diminish my children and highlight our financial limitations, but instead, they'd created the perfect backdrop for Katie and Ben to demonstrate the wealth of character and values that no amount of money could purchase. Mark joined Jessica in front of me, Ben's keychain now prominently displayed on his key ring. "Lisa, Jessica's right. We both owe you an apology, and we both have a lot to learn from what your kids just did. I've been thinking about how to teach Alex and Emma about gratitude and generosity, but I realize now that I've been approaching it all wrong. I thought expensive gifts and elaborate experiences were the way to show love, but your children just proved that the most powerful gifts come from sacrifice and thoughtfulness, not from spending money." The conversation that followed was unlike any interaction I'd ever had with Jessica and Mark. Instead of the usual polite but superficial chat about work and weather, we found ourselves talking about parenting, values, and what it really means to raise children who understand the difference between wants and needs, between material wealth and emotional richness, between getting and giving. Jessica admitted that she'd been feeling increasingly uncomfortable with how entitled and materialistic Alex and Emma were becoming, despite having everything they could possibly want. Mark confessed that he'd been throwing money at problems instead of taking the time to teach his children about effort, persistence, and the satisfaction that comes from creating something with your own hands. What happened next surprised me even more than everything that had already transpired that morning. Alex, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange while still holding his new gaming controller, suddenly stood up and walked over to where his parents kept their donation box for charity drives. He rummaged through it for a moment before pulling out a slightly worn but still beautiful winter coat that someone had outgrown. Without saying a word, he carried it over to Ben and held it out with both hands. "Ben," Alex said, his voice more serious than I'd ever heard it, "I noticed your jacket has a tear in the sleeve, and this one is really warm. My mom was going to donate it anyway, but I think you should have it instead. It's not new or anything, but it's a good coat, and I want you to have something nice." His gesture was awkward in the way that children's first attempts at genuine generosity often are, but the sincerity behind it was unmistakable. Ben looked at the coat with wide eyes, then up at Alex with surprise and gratitude. "Really? You want to give this to me?" When Alex nodded, Ben carefully took the coat and held it up to examine it. It was clearly expensive, made from high-quality materials that would keep him warm through the harsh Denver winters, and it was exactly his size. "Thank you, Alex. This is really nice. I promise I'll take good care of it." Emma, not to be outdone by her brother's act of generosity, disappeared upstairs and returned a few minutes later carrying an armload of art supplies. She'd gathered colored pencils, sketchbooks, watercolor paints, and brushes that were far superior to anything Katie had ever used, and she spread them out on the coffee table like she was creating a miniature art store. "Katie," she said with growing excitement, "I have way more art stuff than I can ever use, and I know you love to draw and paint. Would you like to have some of these? I could teach you how to use the watercolors if you want." Katie's reaction was pure joy mixed with disbelief. She approached the art supplies with the same reverence she'd shown when unwrapping what she thought were gifts from Jessica earlier that morning. But this time her excitement wasn't destined to end in disappointment. "Emma, are you sure? These look really expensive and nice. I don't want to take your good supplies." Her concern for her cousin's feelings, even in the face of such generous offerings, demonstrated the thoughtfulness that had been guiding her behavior all morning. Emma knelt down beside Katie and started explaining the different types of paints and brushes, her enthusiasm building as she talked about techniques she'd learned in the art classes her parents could afford to provide. "Katie, you're so much more creative than I am. I have all this stuff, but I never make anything as beautiful as your bookmark. I think you'd use these supplies better than I do, and it would make me happy to know they're helping you create more amazing art." The transformation happening in Alex and Emma was remarkable to witness. These children who had grown up surrounded by abundance, who had never had to consider whether they could afford something they wanted, were discovering the joy that comes from giving rather than receiving. They weren't being forced or coerced into sharing their possessions. They were responding to the example my children had set with spontaneous generosity of their own. Jessica and Mark were watching their children with expressions of amazement and pride that I recognized from my own face when Katie and Ben did something unexpectedly wonderful. "I can't believe this," Jessica whispered to me. "Alex has been hoarding his things for years, never wanting to share anything with anyone. And Emma usually gets upset if someone even touches her art supplies. But look at them now." Mark was nodding in agreement, his attention divided between his children's newfound generosity and the keychain that Ben had made for him. It's like watching them discover something they didn't know existed. They've always had everything they wanted, but I don't think they've ever experienced the satisfaction that comes from making someone else happy through their own sacrifice. The ripple effects of Katie and Ben's actions were continuing to spread through the room in ways that none of us could have anticipated. My mother approached Jessica's parents, who had been standing awkwardly in the corner since the empty box incident, and began talking to them about the importance of teaching children to value relationships over possessions. Mark's sister was having a quiet conversation with her own children about the difference between gifts that cost money and gifts that cost time and effort. Even the adults were beginning to reassess their own behavior and priorities. Jessica's mother-in-law, who had initially laughed at the empty box prank, approached me with obvious embarrassment and said, "Lisa, I want you to know that I didn't realize how hurtful that joke was going to be. Your children's response has made me think about how we sometimes treat generosity as entertainment, and I'm ashamed that I participated in that." Her apology was genuine and thoughtful, and it represented the kind of self-reflection that rarely happens during casual social gatherings. The morning had taken on a quality that felt almost sacred, as if we were all witnessing something that would change how we understood the relationships between giving and receiving, between material wealth and spiritual richness, between the values we claim to hold and the values we actually demonstrate through our actions. Katie and Ben had become unwitting teachers, showing everyone present what authentic generosity looked like when it wasn't calculated or performed for social credit. Katie was now settled on the floor with Emma, completely absorbed in learning about different watercolor techniques and experimenting with colors she'd never had access to before. Her concentration was absolute, and she approached each new instruction with the dedication of someone who understood that she was receiving not just art supplies, but also knowledge and friendship from her cousin. Emma, meanwhile, was discovering the joy of teaching, explaining techniques with patience and enthusiasm that revealed her own deeper understanding of the artistic process. Ben and Alex had moved to the other side of the room, where Alex was showing Ben how to properly care for the winter coat he'd given him and explaining the features that made it particularly effective in cold weather. But their conversation had evolved beyond just the coat to include discussions about school, friends, and the kinds of activities they enjoyed. It was the first time I'd seen the two boys connect on a personal level, rather than just interacting, as cousins who saw each other occasionally at family gatherings. The change in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Where there had been tension and discomfort following Jessica's cruel joke, there was now warmth and genuine connection. Where there had been artificial politeness and barely concealed judgment, there was now authentic conversation and mutual respect. The expensive gifts that had dominated the morning were still scattered around the room, but they no longer seemed to be the focus of anyone's attention. Jessica sat down beside me on the couch, still holding Katie's bookmark like it was something precious that needed to be protected. "Lisa, I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll let me finish before you respond." Her voice was quieter than usual, lacking the confident tone that typically characterized her interactions with me. "I've been jealous of you for years, and I've been expressing that jealousy in ways that were cruel and unfair." Her admission caught me completely off guard. Jessica, with her perfect house and successful career and financial security, jealous of me? The idea seemed impossible, given the obvious disparities in our circumstances and opportunities. "Jealous of what?" I asked, genuinely confused by her statement. "Jealous of the relationship you have with your children," she replied without hesitation. "Jealous of how they look at you, how they trust you, how they want to spend time with you. Alex and Emma have everything money can buy, but they don't look at me the way Katie and Ben look at you. They don't make me gifts or save their allowance money to buy me things or think about what would make me happy. They love me, I know. They do, but it's not the same kind of love. It's not the deep, connected, sacrificial love that your children have for you." Her words hit me with unexpected force because they revealed a truth I hadn't fully recognized myself. Despite all the financial struggles and late-night worries and moments of wondering whether I was doing enough for my children, I had something that money couldn't purchase and that many people with far more resources never achieved. I had the kind of relationship with Katie and Ben that was built on mutual respect, shared experiences, and genuine affection rather than on the exchange of expensive gifts or the provision of material advantages. "Jessica," I said carefully, "that kind of relationship doesn't happen automatically. It requires time and attention and being present in ways that can't be scheduled or delegated. You and Mark both work demanding jobs, and you provide beautiful experiences for your children. But when was the last time you sat on the floor and played with them without checking your phone? When did you last have a conversation with Alex or Emma that wasn't about logistics or performance or what they needed for school? She was quiet for a long moment, considering my questions with obvious discomfort. "You're right," she finally admitted. "We give them everything except our undivided attention. We buy them experiences instead of creating memories with them. We provide for them instead of connecting with them." She paused and looked over at where Emma was patiently teaching Katie about color mixing. "Look at Emma right now. I haven't seen her this engaged and happy in months, and it's because she's sharing something she loves with someone who appreciates it. When was the last time she was that excited about anything we bought her?" Mark had been listening to our conversation, and he joined in with his own observations. Alex put down his new gaming system to give Ben that coat. "Do you realize what that means? He's been talking about wanting that particular game for months, and when he finally got it this morning, he played with it for maybe 30 minutes before something more important captured his attention. That coat has been sitting in our donation box for weeks, but today it became meaningful because he could use it to help someone he cares about." The insights that Jessica and Mark were having about their own parenting were profound, but they were also painful. They were recognizing that despite their best intentions and abundant resources, they had somehow missed the essential elements that create deep, lasting bonds between parents and children. They had confused providing for their children with connecting with them, and they were seeing the results of that confusion in the superficial nature of their family relationships. But the morning was also showing them that it wasn't too late to change course. Emma's joy in teaching Katie about art techniques was revealing her capacity for genuine generosity and connection that had been waiting for the right opportunity to emerge. Alex's spontaneous decision to give Ben the winter coat demonstrated empathy and thoughtfulness that his parents hadn't realized he possessed. Their children weren't inherently selfish or materialistic. They had simply been operating within a family culture that emphasized acquisition over relationship, possession over connection. "The thing is," I said to Jessica and Mark, "you can't buy the kind of relationship you're envying. It has to be built through thousands of small interactions, through being present during the ordinary moments, through prioritizing time together over individual achievements or acquisitions. Katie and Ben trust me and want to give to me because they know I'm genuinely interested in their thoughts and feelings and experiences, not just their performance or behavior." Jessica was nodding slowly, and I could see her processing the implications of what I was saying. "So when Alex brings home a good grade, we celebrate by buying him something he wants. But when does he get to tell us about what he learned, or why the subject interests him, or how he feels about his progress?" She looked over at her son, who was now helping Ben try on the winter coat and adjusting the hood to fit properly. "And when Emma shows us her artwork, we praise it and put it on the refrigerator. But do we ever ask her about her creative process or what she was thinking about while she made it?" Mark was having similar realizations about his own parenting approach. "I spend hours researching the best toys and gadgets to buy for them, but I can't remember the last time I spent hours just talking to them about their interests or dreams or concerns. I know what they want for Christmas, but do I really know what makes them happy or what they worry about or what they hope for their futures?" The conversation we were having was the kind that rarely happens during casual family gatherings, but the morning's events had created an opening for honesty and reflection that might not have occurred under normal circumstances. Katie and Ben's demonstration of genuine generosity had forced all of us to examine our own values and behaviors, and the results of that examination were both uncomfortable and illuminating. Emma had finished her impromptu art lesson and was now sitting beside Katie, watching her experiment with the new watercolor techniques she'd just learned. "Katie," Emma said thoughtfully, "I want to ask you something. How did you learn to make such beautiful things? Like that bookmark you made for Mom? I've had art supplies for years, but I never make anything that meaningful." Katie looked up from her painting, her face smudged with watercolor, but glowing with happiness. Well, Emma, I think about the person I'm making it for and what would make them smile. Like with Aunt Jessica's bookmark, I remembered that she likes to read, and I thought about what colors she likes, and I wanted her to think about me when she uses it. It's not about making it perfect or expensive. It's about making it with love. Her explanation was so simple and profound that it left Emma speechless for a moment. Here was a 7-year-old articulating a philosophy of creativity and generosity that many adults never fully grasp. The value of a gift didn't come from its cost or complexity, but from the intention and affection behind it. The beauty of a creation wasn't measured by professional standards, but by the love that motivated its maker. Ben, who had been listening while Alex helped him adjust his new coat, added his own perspective. And you have to think about what the person really needs or wants, not just what looks cool, like Uncle Mark's keychain. I noticed he was always patting his pockets looking for his keys, so I wanted to make something that would help him but also remind him that I think he's important. His practical approach to gift-giving revealed the same thoughtfulness that had characterized Katie's artistic creation, but expressed through his more analytical personality. Alex and Emma were absorbing these insights with the intensity of students learning a new subject that fascinated them. They were discovering that the most meaningful gifts required understanding the recipient as a person, considering their genuine needs and preferences, and investing time and effort rather than simply money. It was a lesson about relationship and empathy that no amount of expensive presents could have taught them. The morning was drawing toward noon, but nobody seemed ready to return to their normal routines or typical conversations. The atmosphere in the room had shifted so dramatically that even the physical space seemed different, as if the ugly incident with the empty boxes had been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful through the genuine connections that had emerged in its aftermath. Jessica's parents, who had been quiet observers for most of the morning, finally approached me with expressions of regret and admiration. "Lisa," Jessica's mother said softly, "we owe you an apology for not speaking up when the empty box situation happened. We should have intervened immediately, and we should have recognized what was happening to your children. But more than that, we want you to know how impressed we are with the way you've raised Katie and Ben. They've taught all of us something important today about what really matters." Her words meant more to me than she could have known, because they represented validation from people whose opinions I had always felt were critical of my choices and circumstances. Jessica's parents had money and education and social status, and I had always assumed they looked down on my situation as evidence of poor decisions and inadequate planning. To hear them express genuine respect for my parenting and admiration for my children was both surprising and deeply satisfying. Jessica's father added his own observations. "Lisa, those children of yours have something that can't be taught in schools or bought in stores. They have character, and they have love, and they have the kind of wisdom that comes from being raised by someone who understands what truly matters in life." Jessica and Mark have been talking about hiring tutors and enrolling Alex and Emma in enrichment programs, but what your children demonstrated today can't be learned from any curriculum. The validation was wonderful, but what struck me most was the recognition that the morning's events had created opportunities for healing and connection that extended far beyond the immediate family. Relationships that had been strained by unspoken judgments and assumptions were being rebuilt through honest conversation and mutual respect. The cruel joke that had been intended to diminish my children had instead become the catalyst for deeper understanding and genuine community among people who had been politely distant from each other for years. As the afternoon sunlight began, streaming through Jessica's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm golden patterns across the living room where so much had changed in just a few hours, I realized that we were all different people than we had been when the morning started. The expensive gifts that had seemed so important earlier were now scattered around like forgotten props from a play that had ended, while the simple handmade presents that Katie and Ben had created sat prominently displayed on the mantel where, Jessica had carefully arranged them like precious artifacts. Katie was curled up in an oversized armchair, completely absorbed in creating a new watercolor painting with the supplies Emma had given her. She worked with the focused intensity that always amazed me, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration, as she layered colors to create a sunset that somehow captured both the technical skills Emma had taught her and her own unique artistic vision. Every few minutes, Emma would lean over to offer gentle suggestions or praise Katie's color choices, and their easy collaboration had evolved into the kind of mentorship that benefits both teacher and student. Ben was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the fireplace, carefully documenting the morning's events in a notebook he'd pulled from his backpack. He was creating what he called a scientific observation journal about human behavior, complete with sketches of people's facial expressions during key moments and detailed notes about how the atmosphere in the room had changed throughout the morning. His methodical approach to processing the experience was so thoroughly Ben that it made me smile. But his insights were surprisingly sophisticated for a 7-year-old who was trying to understand complex social dynamics and emotional transformations. Alex had abandoned his new gaming system entirely and was sitting beside Ben, fascinated by the journal project and asking thoughtful questions about Ben's observations. "So you're saying that people's faces looked different after you and Katie gave your presents than they did after Mom did the empty box thing?" Alex asked, studying Ben's sketches with genuine interest. "And you think it's because people felt bad about themselves when they saw how nice you were being?" Ben nodded, seriously pleased to have such an engaged audience for his analysis. "I think sometimes people do mean things because they're feeling bad inside. But then when they see someone being really nice, it makes them remember how they want to be. Like when you gave me this coat, Alex. I could tell it made you feel good. To give me something I needed. Maybe even better than getting your new game made you feel." Their conversation was revealing insights about human nature and motivation that many adults never articulate so clearly. Ben's observational skills and Alex's willingness to engage with complex emotional concepts were creating a dialogue that was both innocent and profound, demonstrating how children can sometimes understand truth more directly than adults who have learned to complicate simple realities with social expectations and defensive behaviors. Mark was standing nearby, listening to the boys' conversation while absently fingering the keychain Ben had made for him. Every few minutes, he would pull out his keys and look at the tiny painted computer, as if he still couldn't quite believe that someone had cared enough to create something so personal and thoughtful specifically for him. "Lisa," he said quietly, "I keep thinking about what Ben said when he gave this to me. He noticed that I'm always losing my keys, which means he was paying attention to my daily life in a way that I didn't even realize. When was the last time I paid that kind of attention to what Alex or Emma might need or struggle with?" His question was rhetorical, but it reflected the kind of self-examination that had been happening throughout the room as the morning's events continued to resonate. Mark was recognizing that genuine care requires observation and attention, that meaningful gifts emerge from understanding rather than from spending, and that his children had been demonstrating needs and interests that he had been too distracted to notice. Jessica was still holding Katie's bookmark, but now she was reading from a book she'd retrieved from her personal library, using the pressed flower creation to mark her place exactly as Katie had intended. The simple functionality of the gift, combined with its beauty and the love behind it, had made it more valuable to her than the expensive jewelry and designer accessories she typically received during holidays and special occasions. "You know what strikes me most about this bookmark?" she said, addressing the room in general. "It's not just that Katie made it for me, but that she paid attention to things about me that I didn't think anyone noticed. She remembered that I like to read. She chose flowers in colors that match my living room, and she created something that I'll use regularly and think about every time I see it." Her observation highlighted one of the most powerful aspects of Katie and Ben's gifts. They weren't just handmade objects created to fulfill a social obligation or demonstrate craft skills. They were expressions of relationship, proof that my children had been observing and caring about their aunt and uncle in ways that transformed casual family connections into something deeper and more meaningful. The bookmark and keychain had become symbols of attention, affection, and genuine consideration that couldn't be replicated through any amount of money or shopping effort. My mother, who had been quietly observing the transformations happening around the room, finally approached, me with tears in her eyes and pride written across her face. "Lisa, I need to tell you something that I should have said years ago. When you got pregnant so young and then went through the divorce, I worried constantly about whether you'd be able to provide everything Katie and Ben would need. I worried about their education, their opportunities, their future security. But watching them today, seeing the kind of people they're becoming, I realize that you've given them something far more important than financial advantages or material possessions. You've given them character." Her words carried the weight of years of unspoken concern and newly recognized respect. My mother had witnessed my struggles as a single parent, had seen me work multiple jobs and sacrifice my own comfort for the sake of my children's well-being, and had worried that love and dedication might not be sufficient to ensure their success and happiness. The morning's events had provided her with evidence that the values I'd been trying to instill in Katie and Ben were not only taking root, but were strong enough to influence and inspire the adults around them. "Mom," I replied, my own voice thick, with emotion. There were so many nights when I lay awake wondering if I was doing enough, if I was making the right choices, if my kids would grow up feeling deprived or resentful about the things I couldn't give them. But today showed me that children don't measure love in terms of expense accounts or luxury vacations. They understand love through consistency, attention, and the security that comes from knowing they're genuinely valued for who they are, rather than what they achieve or possess. The conversation that followed involved everyone in the room and touched on topics that families rarely discuss openly. We talked about the difference between providing for children and connecting with them, about the challenges of raising grateful and generous children in a culture that equates worth with wealth, and about the ways that material abundance can sometimes interfere with the development of character and empathy if it's not balanced with opportunities for service and sacrifice. Jessica's in-laws, who had initially seemed uncomfortable with the morning's emotional intensity, gradually became more engaged in the discussion as they began sharing their own experiences and concerns about raising children in privileged circumstances. "We've been so focused on giving Alex and Emma every advantage," Mark's mother admitted, "that we may have inadvertently deprived them of the satisfaction that comes from working for things they want, and the empathy that develops when you understand that not everyone has the same opportunities." Mark's father nodded in agreement, looking thoughtfully at his grandchildren who were still absorbed in their collaborative projects with Katie and Ben. Watching Alex give Ben that coat and seeing how good it made him feel, I realized that we've been robbing our grandchildren of chances to experience generosity. We give them everything they want before they can even ask for it, which means they never have opportunities to save money for something special or to make sacrifices for other people. Their insights reflected a growing understanding that privilege, while providing many advantages, also creates unique challenges for parents who want to raise children with strong values and genuine empathy. The morning's events had demonstrated that Katie and Ben, despite having far fewer material advantages than their cousins, possessed something that couldn't be purchased or inherited. They had learned to find joy in giving rather than getting, to value relationships over possessions, and to respond to cruelty with kindness rather than retaliation. As the afternoon progressed, the conversations naturally evolved from analysis of what had happened to planning for how relationships and behaviors might change going forward. Jessica and Mark began discussing ways to create opportunities for Alex and Emma to experience the satisfaction of earning money for purchases they wanted, of choosing to give up something they valued for the benefit of someone else, and of creating, rather than consuming as a primary source of satisfaction and accomplishment. "I want to start a family tradition," Jessica announced, her voice filled with newfound determination. "Every month, we're going to choose a different way to help someone, Else, and Alex and Emma will be involved in planning and executing the help. Maybe 1 month we'll cook meals for families going through difficult times. Another month we'll make care packages for homeless individuals. Another month we'll create handmade gifts for elderly people in nursing homes. The important thing is that it will require time and effort from all of us, not just writing a check to charity. Mark was enthusiastic about Jessica's proposal and began adding his own ideas. And I want to institute a new rule about gifts in our family. For every birthday and holiday, each person has to give one purchased gift and one handmade gift. That way, Alex and Emma will have regular opportunities to think creatively about what would bring joy to someone else and to invest their own time and energy in creating something meaningful. Their planning session was inspiring to witness because it represented genuine commitment to changing patterns and priorities that had been established over years of well-intentioned but ultimately counterproductive parenting choices. They weren't just having temporary emotional reactions to the morning's events. They were recognizing the need for fundamental shifts in how they approached family life and child rearing. Katie looked up from her watercolor painting, which had evolved into a beautiful landscape featuring pressed flowers similar to the ones she'd used in Jessica's bookmark. "Aunt Jessica," she said with characteristic directness, "are you and Uncle Mark going to start making things too? Because Emma taught me some really good techniques today, and I could teach you if you want. Making presents is more fun when grown-ups. Do it with kids." Her innocent offer highlighted one of the most important insights from the morning's experience: the joy and satisfaction that come from creating rather than purchasing, from giving rather than receiving, and from connecting rather than impressing are available to people of all ages and circumstances. Katie's suggestion that the adults join in the creative process wasn't just about arts and crafts. It was about participating in the kind of meaningful activity that builds relationships and creates lasting memories. Emma immediately endorsed Katie's suggestion with enthusiasm. "Yes. Mom! We could work on projects together, and you could learn some of the art techniques I've been taking classes for. It would be fun to teach you things instead of you always teaching me." Her excitement about reversing traditional roles and becoming a teacher rather than just a student reflected her growing confidence and her desire to contribute meaningfully to family activities. Alex was equally eager to involve his parents in hands-on creative work. "Dad, maybe you could help me learn how to make things like Ben's keychain. I know you're good with computers, but it might be cool to make physical things too. And we could work on projects for other people like Ben and Katie did today." His suggestion revealed his understanding that the morning's most powerful moments had emerged from the intersection of creativity, generosity, and genuine care for others. The enthusiasm from all 4 children created momentum for immediate action rather than just future planning. Jessica disappeared into her craft room and returned with supplies that could accommodate a group art project, while Mark cleared space on the large dining room table where everyone could work comfortably. Within minutes, adults and children were sitting together, brainstorming ideas for handmade gifts they could create for various family members and friends. The collaborative project that emerged was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in Jessica's typically pristine and formal home. The dining room table was covered with art supplies, construction paper, glue, scissors, and various materials that would normally have been confined to designated craft areas. But instead of chaos, there was purposeful creativity as each person worked on individual projects while contributing to a collective sense of accomplishment and connection. Ben appointed himself as the project coordinator, moving around the table to offer suggestions and encouragement to each participant. His natural leadership skills and genuine interest in helping others succeed made him an effective facilitator, and even the adults began deferring to his organizational suggestions. "Uncle Mark," he said seriously, "I think your keychain design would work better if you made the letters a little bigger so people can read them more easily. And Grandma, your flower pressing technique is really good, but maybe try using a little less pressure so the petals don't get too flat." His feedback was delivered with such kindness and genuine desire to help that no one felt criticized or inadequate. despite the fact that a 7-year-old was instructing adults about craft techniques they had never attempted before. Ben's approach demonstrated the same thoughtfulness and consideration that had characterized his original gift to Mark, and it was having the same effect of making people feel valued and supported rather than judged or inadequate. Katie had naturally assumed the role of creative inspiration, moving from person to person to admire their work and offer artistic suggestions that helped each participant develop their individual style and vision. Her enthusiasm for everyone's efforts was infectious, and her genuine excitement about each person's creative choices helped maintain the positive, collaborative atmosphere that made the project successful for participants of all ages and skill levels. As the afternoon light began to fade and the time came for Katie, Ben, and me to return home, the transformation in Jessica's house was visible in ways that went far beyond the art supplies scattered across surfaces that were usually kept clear and decorated with expensive accessories. The relationships between family members had shifted from polite formality to genuine warmth. The conversations had evolved from superficial pleasantries to meaningful exchanges about values and priorities, and the atmosphere had changed from competitive display to collaborative creativity. Jessica and Mark walked us to the door, but instead of the usual quick goodbyes and promises to stay in touch that typically ended our visits, they lingered on the front porch, reluctant to let the day's connections fade back into routine distance. "Lisa," Jessica said, her voice still carrying the emotional weight of everything that had transpired, "I want you to know that today changed me in ways I'm still processing. Katie and Ben didn't just give us handmade gifts. They gave us a completely different understanding of what generosity looks like and what family relationships can be when they're built on genuine care rather than social obligation." Mark was nodding in agreement, Ben's keychain still prominently displayed on his keyring. "We've been talking about wanting our kids to be more grateful and less entitled, but we never understood that the solution wasn't lectures or restrictions. It was modeling and opportunities. Your children showed our children what gratitude and generosity actually look like in practice, and they did it through example rather than explanation." Their words carried the sincerity of people who had experienced genuine insight rather than temporary emotion, and I could see that the changes in their perspective were likely to have lasting effects on how they approached parenting and family relationships. The morning had created the kind of breakthrough that happens rarely, but changes everything when it does occur. The drive home through Denver's familiar streets felt different than usual, not because the scenery had changed, but because Katie and Ben were processing their own insights about the day's events. They talked quietly in the back seat about their cousin's willingness to share expensive possessions, about the adults' emotional reactions to handmade gifts, and about their own feelings of satisfaction from giving rather than receiving. "Mom," Katie said thoughtfully as we pulled into our driveway, "I think Aunt Jessica was sad before we gave her the bookmark, but she didn't know why. Do you think people sometimes forget how to be happy with simple things because they have too many complicated things?" Her question revealed the kind of intuitive understanding about human nature that continues to amaze me about children's capacity for insight. Ben added his own observation with characteristic analytical precision. "I think Alex and Emma liked giving us things even more than they liked getting new stuff this morning. Maybe that's because giving makes you feel important in a different way than having expensive things does. Like, when you give someone something they need, you know you actually helped them. But when you just have something expensive, you only helped yourself." Their reflections demonstrated that they had absorbed lessons from the morning's experience that went far beyond the immediate situation. They were developing philosophical frameworks for understanding human behavior, motivation, and satisfaction that would serve them well throughout their lives. The cruel joke that had been intended to diminish them had instead become the catalyst for insights and growth that benefited everyone involved. That evening, as we settled into our usual routine of homework, dinner, and story time in our small duplex, I found myself looking around our modest home with new appreciation for what we had built together, the walls covered with Katie's artwork and Ben's school achievements, the secondhand furniture that we had chosen together, and arranged to create maximum comfort and functionality. The books and games and simple treasures that reflected our shared interests and values, all of it seemed more precious than ever because I understood more clearly how rare and valuable our family culture actually was. The Christmas morning that had started with deliberate cruelty and public humiliation had been transformed through my children's instinctive generosity into something beautiful and healing that would influence relationships and priorities for years to come. Katie and Ben had responded to empty boxes with full hearts, and in doing so, they had filled a room full of people with understanding about what truly matters during the holidays and throughout the year. As I tucked them into bed that night, both children clutching new treasures given by cousins who had discovered the joy of generous sharing, I realized that the greatest gift of the day hadn't been the art supplies, or the winter coat, or even the handmade bookmark and keychain. The greatest gift had been the reminder that love expressed through sacrifice and thoughtfulness has the power to transform relationships, heal wounds, and create connections that endure long after expensive presents are forgotten or outgrown. The empty boxes that were meant to teach my children about disappointment and limitations had instead taught an entire family about abundance and possibility. And that lesson, wrapped in pressed flowers and polymer clay, painted with watercolors, and written in careful 7-year-old handwriting, was worth more than any gift that money could buy. 3 months after that transformative Christmas morning, I was sitting in my car outside Jefferson Elementary School, waiting for Katie and Ben to finish their after-school art club, when my phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and I answered, expecting the usual brief check-in conversation we'd been having more frequently since the holidays. Instead, her voice carried an excitement I rarely heard from my typically composed sister. "Lisa, you're not going to believe what happened today," she began, without her usual pleasantries. "Alex came home from school and announced that he wants to donate half of his birthday money to help families who can't afford school supplies. Not because Mark and I suggested it, not because he's trying to earn some kind of reward, but because he said he's been thinking about how good it felt to give Ben that coat, and he wants to feel that way again." Her excitement was infectious, and I found myself smiling as I listened to her describe Alex's initiative. But she wasn't finished with her update. "And Emma has been teaching art techniques to younger children at the community center every Saturday morning. She says she loves watching kids discover they can create beautiful things with simple materials, just like Katie showed her with the pressed flowers. Lisa, our children are becoming different people, better people, because of what your kids taught them that day." The ripple effects of Katie and Ben's Christmas morning generosity had been expanding in ways that none of us could have predicted. What had started as a spontaneous response to cruelty had evolved into lasting changes in behavior, priorities, and relationships that were transforming not just our immediate family, but extending into the broader community through the children's new commitments to service and giving. Jessica continued sharing the developments in her household with obvious pride and amazement. Mark started volunteering at a local nonprofit that teaches computer skills to unemployed adults, and he brings Alex with him sometimes so Alex can see how his father's expertise can help people improve their circumstances. And I've been working with Emma on a project to create handmade cards for patients at the Children's Hospital. She designs them, and I help with the production. But the ideas and the artistic vision are completely hers. The changes Jessica described represented fundamental shifts in how their family spent time and energy. Instead of focusing primarily on acquiring possessions and experiences for themselves, they were discovering fulfillment through contributing to the well-being of others. The satisfaction they were finding in service and creativity was replacing the temporary pleasure they had previously sought through expensive purchases and exclusive activities. But the most remarkable change, Jessica continued, is in how Alex and Emma relate to each other and to us. They're more patient, more considerate, more interested in having real conversations about meaningful topics. Yesterday, Emma asked me about my childhood and what I learned from my parents about treating people kindly. Alex has been reading books about different cultures and asking thoughtful questions about inequality and fairness. They're becoming the kind of people I always hoped they would be, but I didn't know how to guide them in that direction. Her observations reflected the profound truth that children learn more from witnessing authentic behavior than from receiving instructions about proper conduct. Katie and Ben's demonstration of genuine generosity had provided Alex and Emma with a template for meaningful living that was more powerful than any lecture or rule could have been. They were internalizing values through experience rather than memorizing principles through repetition. When Katie and Ben emerged from the school building, chattering excitedly about their art projects and the stories they had shared with younger students during the club meeting, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path our lives had taken. The financial struggles and social challenges that had once seemed like obstacles to my children's development had actually contributed to their character formation in ways that privilege and abundance might not have achieved. That evening, as we sat around our small kitchen table sharing dinner and discussing the day's events, Ben made an announcement that surprised me with its thoughtfulness and ambition. "Mom, I've been thinking about something for a few weeks now, and I want to tell you about an idea I have." His serious tone indicated that this wasn't a casual childhood whim, but a carefully considered proposal that he had been developing over time. "You know how I like to observe people and figure out why they do things?" he continued, referring to the analytical approach to human behavior that had been evident since he was very young. "Well, I've been watching how different families interact, and I've noticed that some kids seem happier even when they don't have as much money or as many toys. I think it's because their parents pay more attention to them as people, rather than just providing things for them." His insight was remarkably sophisticated for a 7-year-old, but it reflected the kind of deep thinking that had always characterized Ben's approach to understanding the world around him. He had been conducting his own informal research about family dynamics and had reached conclusions that aligned with professional studies about child development and family satisfaction. "So I want to start a club at school," Ben announced, "where kids can teach each other skills that don't cost money but make people feel good about themselves. Like Katie could teach art techniques, and I could teach kids how to observe and understand animal behavior, and other kids could share things they know how to do well. We could call it the Sharing Skills Club, and everyone would be both a teacher and a student." His proposal demonstrated the same generous spirit that had motivated his Christmas gift to Mark, but expanded into a systematic approach to building community and connection among his peers. Ben had recognized that children possessed knowledge and abilities that could enrich each other's lives if they had opportunities to share what they knew, rather than just competing for external validation. Katie was immediately enthusiastic about Ben's idea and began adding her own suggestions for how the club could function. "We could have different themes each week," she said, her artistic mind already visualizing the possibilities. "One week could be about making things with recycled materials. Another week could be about growing plants. Another week could be about telling stories or writing poems. And kids who don't think they're good at anything could discover they actually know lots of things that other kids want to learn." The collaboration between Katie and Ben in developing this concept reflected the kind of partnership that had been evident throughout their lives. They complemented each other's strengths and perspectives, creating ideas that were more comprehensive and inclusive than either of them could have developed alone. Their ability to work together toward common goals was one of the gifts that had emerged from our family's focus on cooperation rather than competition. Over the following weeks, Katie and Ben worked with their teachers and school administrators to establish the Sharing Skills Club, and the response from other students exceeded everyone's expectations. Children who had never considered themselves talented or knowledgeable discovered that they possessed skills and interests that their peers valued and wanted to learn. Students who had been academically struggling found new confidence as they taught others about subjects that didn't appear on standardized tests, but were deeply meaningful to them personally. The success of the club attracted attention from parents and community members who began volunteering to support the children's initiatives. Mrs. Rodriguez, our neighbor who had been caring for Katie and Ben during my work hours, became a regular volunteer, sharing her knowledge of traditional crafts and cooking techniques. Other adults contributed expertise in gardening, music, storytelling, and various practical skills that enriched the children's learning experiences. But the most significant impact of the Sharing Skills Club was its effect on the school's overall culture and atmosphere. Competition between students decreased as collaboration increased. Children began celebrating each other's successes rather than feeling threatened by them. Teachers reported improvements in classroom behavior, academic engagement, and social interactions that extended far beyond the club's weekly meetings. The transformation happening at Jefferson Elementary began attracting attention from educators and community leaders throughout the Denver area. Local media outlets started featuring stories about the innovative approach to peer learning and community building that had emerged from two 7-year-olds' vision of sharing rather than hoarding knowledge and skills. Jessica called me one evening to share her amazement at how far the influence of that Christmas morning had spread. "Lisa, do you realize that Alex and Emma's school is now implementing their own version of the Sharing Skills Club? And Mark's company is starting a volunteer program where employees can teach job skills to people in the community who need career development opportunities." That morning, when Katie and Ben gave us those handmade gifts, they started something that's still growing and changing lives months later. Her observation highlighted the exponential nature of generosity and kindness when they're expressed authentically and received with open hearts. The simple act of two children responding to cruelty with love had created expanding circles of positive change that were touching lives far beyond our immediate family. The empty boxes that were meant to teach lessons about disappointment had, instead, become catalysts for discoveries about abundance, connection, and the power of generous living. As spring turned into summer and the first anniversary of our transformative Christmas approached, I found myself reflecting on the profound changes that had occurred in all of our lives. Katie and Ben had grown in confidence and leadership skills as they continued developing programs and initiatives that brought people together around shared interests and mutual support. Their natural inclination toward generosity had evolved into systematic approaches to community building that were influencing peers, adults, and institutions throughout our area. The relationship between our family and Jessica's had deepened into genuine friendship and mutual support that extended far beyond holiday gatherings and social obligations. We began spending regular time together, not because of family duty, but because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company and shared common values about raising children who understood their responsibility to contribute positively to the world around them. Mark and Jessica's transformation from competitive consumers to thoughtful contributors had been gradual but thorough. They had downsized their gift-giving to focus on meaningful rather than expensive presents, increased their volunteer commitments to include regular family service projects, and restructured their social activities to emphasize relationship building over status display. Their children had responded to these changes with enthusiasm rather than resentment, confirming that Alex and Emma had been craving more purposeful and connected family experiences. The success of the various initiatives that had grown out of Katie and Ben's Christmas morning generosity had also attracted attention from organizations and institutions interested in promoting similar approaches to community building and character development. Invitations to speak at educational conferences and community gatherings began arriving regularly, though Katie and Ben approached these opportunities with the same genuine desire to help others that had motivated their original gifts to Jessica and Mark. During one particularly memorable presentation to a group of teachers and parents, Katie was asked to explain why she thought handmade gifts were more meaningful than expensive purchases. Her response captured the essence of everything that had happened since that transformative Christmas morning. "When you make something for someone," she said with the clarity that had always characterized her communication, "you have to think about what would make them happy, and you have to spend time working on it, and you have to use your own money or materials. So when you give it to them, you have to think about what would make them happy, and you have to spend time working on it, and you have to use your own money or materials. So when you give it to them, you have to think about what would make them happy, and you have to use your own money or materials. So when you give it to them, you have to think about what would make them happy, and you have to use your own money or materials. So when you give it to them, you have to think about what would make them happy, and you have to use your own money or materials. So when you give it to them, you have to think about what would make them happy, and you have to use your own money or materials. So when you give it to them, you have to think about what would make them happy, and you have to use your own money or materials. So when you give it to them, you have to think about what would make them happy, and you have to use your own money or materials. So when you give it to them, you have to think about what would make them happy, and you have to use your own money or materials. So when you give it to them, you have to think about what would make them happy, and you have to use your own money or materials. So when you give it to them, you have to think about what would make them happy, They know you really cared about them enough to sacrifice something for them. That's different from just buying something expensive, because buying something just means you had money, but making something means you had love. Ben added his own perspective with characteristic analytical precision. And when someone gives you something they made themselves, it changes how you think about giving too. Because you realize that the best gifts aren't the ones that cost the most money, they're the ones that required the most thought and care. So then you want to make things for other people, and that makes everyone happier because giving feels better than getting when you're doing it for the right reasons. Their explanations demonstrated the maturity and wisdom that had developed through their experiences of both giving and receiving authentic generosity. Katie and Ben had learned through practice rather than theory that meaningful relationships are built through mutual care and sacrifice rather than through exchanges of material goods or social advantages. As we drove home from that presentation, Katie and Ben were unusually quiet, processing the questions they had been asked and the responses they had given. Finally, Katie broke the silence with a question that revealed her ongoing development as a thoughtful person. "Mom, do you think we would have learned all these things about giving and caring if Aunt Jessica hadn't done that mean thing with the empty boxes?" Her question required careful consideration because it touched on the complex relationship between adversity and growth, between painful experiences and positive outcomes. "I think you both have always had generous hearts," I replied thoughtfully. "But I also think that sometimes difficult experiences help us discover strengths we didn't know we had." What happened that Christmas morning gave you an opportunity to show who you really are, and it gave everyone else a chance to learn from your example. Ben nodded slowly, understanding the nuance in my response. "So maybe bad things can become good things if we choose to respond in good ways instead of bad ways. Like instead of getting mad at Aunt Jessica for the empty boxes, we decided to give her and Uncle Mark real presents, and that made everything better for everyone." His insight captured one of the most important lessons that had emerged from our family's experience. The power to transform negative situations into positive outcomes often lies in how we choose to respond rather than in our ability to control what happens to us. Katie and Ben had instinctively understood this principle and had acted on it with remarkable wisdom and maturity. As we pulled into our driveway that evening, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey our family had taken and the lessons we had learned together. The modest duplex that had once seemed inadequate compared to Jessica's mansion now felt like the perfect home for children who were learning to value character over possessions, relationships over status, and service over self-indulgence. The Christmas that had started with empty boxes had filled our lives with experiences and relationships that were richer and more meaningful than anything money could have purchased. Katie and Ben had discovered the joy of giving. Jessica and Mark had rediscovered the importance of genuine connection, and extended family members had found new ways to relate to each other with authenticity rather than pretense. But perhaps most importantly, the ripple effects of that transformative morning had created opportunities for dozens of other children and families to discover similar truths about generosity, community, and the power of choosing kindness in response to adversity. The Sharing Skills Club had become a model for schools throughout the region. The volunteer initiatives had expanded into ongoing community programs, and the relationships that had been healed and strengthened continued to provide support and encouragement for everyone involved. As I tucked Katie and Ben into bed that night, both of them exhausted but exhilarated from their day of teaching and sharing with others, I realized that the greatest gift of that Christmas morning hadn't been the transformation of cruel joke into generous response. Though that had been remarkable, the greatest gift had been the discovery that love expressed through sacrifice and thoughtfulness has unlimited power to create positive change in the world. The empty boxes that were meant to diminish my children had instead revealed their capacity for grace under pressure, their instinct for healing rather than retaliation, and their understanding that true abundance comes from giving rather than receiving. Those lessons, learned through experience and shared through example, had become the foundation for a way of living that brought joy and meaning to everyone it touched. And as I reflected on the year that had passed since that pivotal Christmas morning, I understood that Katie and Ben's response to Jessica's cruel joke had taught all of us the most important lesson of all, that the way we choose to treat others, especially when they don't deserve our kindness, reveals who we really are and determines the kind of world we create together. The empty boxes had been filled with love, and that love had overflowed into lives and communities far beyond anything any of us could have imagined on that December morning when everything changed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.